The Bard class in Dungeons & Dragons draws heavily from real-life Bards, Skalds and a few others. Stick around and I'll tell you where it all comes from, part 2. Hello everyone, Funky Monkey here. I didn't know if I should use the same intro as I did in my previous video regarding Bards, but eventually I said nah. I'm still wearing the same t-shirt, although it's clean, I have a tasty beverage in my new cup, and I have a orange and black and white cat in my lap to keep me company while I'm taking you on this wild ride through history. On today's episode, we are continuing our journey through the history of the Bards and discovering where these lovable and chokeable scoundrels actually come from. Before we dive in, let me talk about the miniatures I'm going to be painting today, otherwise I might forget some aspects because oh boy, we have quite a chunky video. Today I am painting 6 barbed devils from WizKids at the same time. Mostly I will be using the dry brushing technique and I will be employing acrylic inks. I'm experimenting a little bit with the painting today as I am experimenting with the longer form video. So strap in and let's talk about the barbed devils. I am starting by zenithal priming these minis, using storm vermin fur as a base and then catching the details with Corax white. I prefer using storm vermin fur in this case instead of, let's say, Abaddon black, for example, or any other black paints, because I will be using somewhat brighter colors and it will be a little bit difficult to cover black. This is a slightly tedious process, but a good base coat ensures a smooth painting process. Welcome to the Middle Ages. In this time period, we start recognizing the profession we are familiar with either by watching Critical Role and seeing how Scanlan is portrayed and played, or by watching perhaps the Witcher series and seeing how Yaxir interacts with the world, or by playing video games such as Final Fantasy XIV and playing a Bard, or any other video games that portray bards, minstrels and troubadours. With that segue, let us begin talking about minstrels. First mentioned between the 4th and the 6th century CE as being performers and lore keepers, by the 12th century they evolved in the profession we recognize from works of fiction. While some minstrels were in the patronage of noble houses, most roamed the land and spread their works. They didn't always create their own songs and stories, perhaps because they were illiterate or because it was easier to copy somebody else's work and simply perform it, but they memorized vast amounts of poems, songs and stories. If you think about it, because they gathered so many myths and stories and they were traveling, this is one way of spreading similar stories and legends across borders and nations. Because guilds were a very big thing in medieval Europe, between the 13th and the 14th century, across Europe minstrels began organizing in guilds. This allowed them to be properly trained in their craft and in manners. In the 15th century, in Flanders, there were rules and laws set in place for the Minstrels Guild. Some of these rules were quite interesting, stating that minstrels had to perform and practice together, so they were jamming, and they were expected to perform during public events using very loud instruments to easily be heard over the crowd. According to medieval documents, during Lent, when entertainment, especially in Europe in the Christian world, was kind of frowned upon because religion, minstrels employed by noble houses were allowed to visit minstrel schools, where they were able to exchange knowledge, songs, dances, stories, and learn even new instruments. And most importantly, they would be able to catch up with all the juicy gossip and rumors. Around the 16th century, the role in society started to substantially diminish, but it never really vanished completely. With the minstrels out of the way, let us talk about troubadours and trobairids. Troubadour comes from the Occitan word trobar, which means to invent. Trobairids is the feminine form of the word troubadour. Troubadours were in essence poets that put lyrics to music. They were mostly found in southern Europe, around noble houses or noble courts. Although they had some political leeway when performing, most of their works revolved around love or conversations between two or more people, but still around love or religion. Most of their poems were satirical in nature. The impact that these medieval poets had on the craft can still be felt to this day. Let me explain. They created multiple ways and forms of delivering their poems. One such method is the balada, a song dance with a refrain. This means that usually the first line of the poem is the same, is fixed, while all the other lines in the poem are different. Every 5 or 6 lines, the first line, the fixed one, the refrain, repeats itself. And as a general rule, if you remember your high school studies, the rhyme of the poems had to be in the form of AABB. Another method invented by troubadours was the pastorela. It's the classical story of boy meets girls, boy is rich, girl is poor, but in keeping with the times, he usually was a knight while she usually was a shepherdess. The pastorelas usually had multiple possible endings, and depending on the mood of the troubadour or trobairids and that of the audience, one appropriate ending would be selected. Almost all of these poems put to songs were satirical in nature or comedic. Another form was jeu party, a debate between two poets around love. And one final form invented by troubadours and trobairids was the alba. Alba is a poem set to music that paints the picture of two lovers that spend the night together, but come morning they need separate. Otherwise, they will be discovered by a jealous husband or by a rival. In Albas, there was always a third character. No, not like that. Get your mind out of the gutter. The third character was a sentry, a lookout. Somebody that alerted the lovers that morning was coming. In these performances, the sentry was almost always berated for either snoozing and failing to alert the lovers of the coming of morning, or they were berated because they separated the lovers too early. When it comes to troubadour and trobairids' creation, most of them were partially original, in the sense that the music composition was almost always copied off of another artist or copied from Latin sacred melodies, while the lyrics themselves were original creations. If the poems were not of original creation and they were copied off of another troubadour or trobairids or minstrel or another artist, because poetry was considered to be very personal, the original creator would be credited. When it comes to music, it was up for grabs, especially because it was, like I said, not stolen but borrowed from Latin sacred melodies. And with that, we are done talking about minstrels, troubadours and trobairids, but we're not yet done going through the history of the Bard class in Dungeons & Dragons. Before we continue, make sure you take a moment, hit that like button if you enjoyed the video thus far, and I'm gonna start talking about the miniatures, give them the attention they deserve. I am struggling with the handle and the sticky tack is not holding that well either, and the mini is falling off my improvised support. Nonetheless, we work with what we have. Things are looking pretty good thus far. Now I need to tackle the other 3 devils. I'm using a mix of Katachan flesh and Elysian green for the devil's skins, and I am applying it through dry brushing, making sure I leave the chest, belly and undersides of the arms untouched. I'm making sure I don't touch the flames either, as that would be a disaster. I also really need to work on that support. Welcome back. We spoke of minstrels, we spoke of troubadours and troubadours. Now let's talk about Skalds. We know them, we love them, but for those who don't, they were poet warriors of the Viking society. They were the ones who preserved deeds of greatness, acts of valor, courage, and general badassery in lyrics. But most importantly, like I just mentioned, they were warriors. They didn't only preserve the deeds of greatness of others, they partook in them. They had a very prominent role in Scandinavian society. They were poets, they were warriors, they were historians and lore keepers, advisors and artists. And they were also mythographers. A mythographer is someone who gathers and perpetuates myth. Like most lore keepers throughout history, they were both revered and feared. They were revered because they kept the deeds of greatness and overcoming of adversity alive. They sang the praises of their comrades and that of their rulers, and they spoke of the gods. They remembered myths, they remembered traditions, and they remembered ceremonies. And they were feared because with their words they could ruin someone's reputation, be it an enemy, a comrade, or even a ruler. Thanks to their skill with words, they were able to ruin one's reputation in a very whimsical and comical fashion, deepening the offense, deepening the embarrassment of their target. It was never a good idea to cross and make an enemy out of a Skald or any lore keeper in general. The first known Skald in Viking history that reached us was named Bragi Bodason, also known as Bragi the Old. He was mentioned in the 9th century CE. Interestingly enough, the name of the god of Skalds in Norse mythology was also Bragi. There are theories that Bragi Bodason was elevated to the status of godhood after his death, but these are only theories and they're not quite relevant at this moment. What is relevant is that Skalds had such an important role in Norse society that there was a patron god of their craft. And this god's wife was the goddess Ayun. How's that for a cliffhanger? Skalds, like troubadours, troubadours and minstrels, found their place around noblemen, singing their praises and creating new sagas, new poems, new epics. On the battlefield, they inspired their allies and they taunted their enemies. How's that for bardic inspiration? Now, I think it is clear why the first iteration of the Bard class in Dungeons & Dragons was a mixture of Bards and Skalds. Initially, they were fighters who evolved into Bards. This is something one can encounter in Final Fantasy XIV, where the Bard is an evolution of the Archer. If you haven't seen my previous video on Bards, make sure you check it out right over there, so you get a more clear picture of the origin of the Bard class in Dungeons & Dragons. With all of that being said, the history of Skalds is vast and the works they left behind are simply enthralling. But we have to move on to other parts of the world, to other bards and to other lore keepers, so we get a more complete picture. Let's move to the other side of the world, to India, where in the Middle Ages we have Bards. Bards are first and foremost lore keepers that serve patrons. They were genealogists, so remembering bloodlines, and mythographers, gatherers and keepers of myth and mythology. Depending on the social status of their patron, they were either very influential and well off, or they were the lowest of the low. What's very interesting to me is that most Bards come from Rajasthan, the northern part of India, the land of kings. This, for me, indicates that either it was a hereditary position or it was one of the most important crafts and practices in the area. They were very influential. They had a lot of power. This authority was almost completely removed by the British after they occupied India. Their social status was directly linked to that of their patrons, and as their patrons experienced social mobility up and down the ladder, so did the Bards serving them. Like Skalds, their proficiency with words and their knowledge allowed them to make or break kings. That might be an exaggeration, but their status, their influence and their skill did allow them to either destroy someone's reputation or improve it. But still exist to this day, they still have some sway, and it is a profession that has survived through centuries of transformation, of evolution, and of oppression. Now let's move again on the other side of the world to West Africa, where we have griots or yelis. Griots are troubadours and historians. They start their training at a very young age, and they serve as lore keepers for all of the knowledge of their people, their community. They preserve knowledge and pass it to newer generations. They are historians, they are genealogists, they are mythographers, they remember the deeds of old, they sing praises, they improve or destroy reputations, and they play an instrument called a kora, which is a lute harp with 21 strings. Because of their vast knowledge, of their intelligence and skills, they were advisors to chieftains, and often they were used as diplomats as well. Over time, their role as advisors and diplomats kind of vanished, but the rest of their roles, that of teachers and lore keepers, was preserved. Now it is time we take another look at the miniatures, spend a little time with them, before we continue with the last piece of our puzzle, fools and jesters. The support, although helpful, is too finicky. I need to come up with something else. Anyway, I'm applying a coat of Agrax Earthshade to the skin of the devils. This way I'm accentuating the brown in the skin, allowing only a hint of green to show through. I'm not avoiding the chest or the lighter parts, those painted with Shapti bone, as the Earthshade will add that hint of shadows and make the colors really pop. If you noticed, I started painting the back of one devil and continued on the front of another. It took me a moment to process this, as I didn't understand what really happened. Thankfully, it's an easy enough fix. Welcome back. As you can see, Potato decided that this is her new home, and there's nothing for me to do than wait for her to want another place. Let's talk about fools. If you have the image of an individual running around in silly clothing with bells and whistles and donkey ears, tumbling, juggling, doing acrobatics, farting, making jokes, and telling stories, well, that is the correct picture. But it's not the full image that you should have. The role of the fool, of the buffoon, has been around, well, since forever. Rulers and the elites wanted entertainment. The masses wanted entertainment. This is where the fools come in. In my opinion, the lines between minstrels, troubadours, and fools are kind of blurred. Let me explain. we have two kinds of fools. We have licensed fools and we have natural fools. And by the way, pot is kinda heavy. Not too heavy, but she is making my hand go numb. But it's okay. So, licensed fools were trained in various arts. They were expected to entertain their patrons and the court and their retinues by telling jokes, by telling stories. Oh, okay. Go up here. Come on. No. Oh, okay. Be gentle. Cool. Sorry. So, licensed, they were trained in different arts. They were supposed to entertain their patrons through storytelling, through poetry, by dancing, singing, telling jokes, farting, whistling, doing acrobatics, and all sorts of faces. They were highly intelligent and they had very sharp tongues. They also always had to keep up with the times and improve their talents and their skills if they wanted to maintain their status and their position around their patrons. They also got away with poking their patrons from time to time, but they had to do it in a very tactful and quite amusing way in order to keep their heads on their shoulders. Now, before you think of this position, of this career path as being a humiliating one and a poor choice, don't be fooled. It was a very coveted position actually. They were almost always at their patron's side, being privy to private discussions, to plans, to news, to plots and rumors and gossip. This made them, alongside their very sharp mind and their skills, the perfect individuals to carry very sensitive private messages. And they were among the few who were able to deliver unfiltered truths to their patrons, even if the patron didn't want to hear that particular truth. They were able to tell kings and queens when they were being plain stupid. Again, they had to do it in a very tactful way, so they didn't risk retaliation. They also had a very important role on battlefields, surprisingly enough. They were taken into battle to lift the troops' spirits and taunt the enemy troops. Also, from time to time, they were sent on missions to deliver messages to the enemy camp, and if the rules of war were followed, they would be basically safe. But we all know that the laws of the war aren't always followed, and as such, sometimes the messenger was killed, executed, made an example of. Fools didn't always have the safest jobs. Now let's talk about natural fools. As opposed to licensed fools who were trained in different crafts and arts, the natural fools amused their patrons and their retinues and the court through their existence. People with deformities, people with hunches, with strange visages, with speech impediments, with neurological issues, with different disabilities. And dwarves were highly prized in medieval times because through their nature they were considered to be entertaining. Unfortunately, that mentality didn't fully go away over centuries. Like licensed fools, they were expected to perform dances and songs and recite poetry and tell stories and give sharp comebacks, but they were also given a little bit more leeway, especially when it came to making fun of those around them, poking fun at their patrons, mostly because some of them had mental issues and those around them knew it and took advantage of it. And although most of the jokes were accepted, there are examples of court members being very offended by jokes that hit too close to home, and they resorted to beating the living everything out of the court fool. One such example comes from the court of Louis XII and Francis I of France. Their court jester, their court fool, was called Triboulet. At one point, Triboulet was beaten to an inch of his death by court members who were very offended by his jokes. On another occasion, he confessed to the king that one court member threatened to kill him. And the king replied in a very witty fashion that the moment he heard that Triboulet was killed by that particular court member, he would have that individual hung within the next quarter hour. And to this Triboulet retorted that, oh, why wouldn't the king hang that individual a quarter hour before he had the chance of killing Triboulet? At one point, actually, Triboulet got in hot water by slapping the queen's bottom. This, of course, threw the king into a blind rage. He ordered Triboulet be executed unless he came up with a more offensive apology than the act of slapping the queen's bottom. Triboulet thought about it for a second and then came up with the following answer. "I'm so sorry, Your Majesty, that I didn't recognize you. I mistook you for the queen." Apparently this amused the king and allowed Triboulet to keep his head on his shoulders. The last time Triboulet got in trouble with the king and the queen was when he broke the capital rule in the court, not to make fun of the queen or her retinue. Upon telling jokes at the queen's expense, she ordered Triboulet be executed. This time, the king couldn't really prevent this. And because Triboulet served the court for a very long time and served it well, he was granted the favor of selecting his own method of dying. After thinking about it for a brief moment, Triboulet said the following: "Good sire, for Saint Nitouche's and Saint Pansard's sake, the patrons of insanity, I choose to die of old age." This apparently amused the king copiously. But as Jeda threw daggers at will after Chris's joke, Francis I threw daggers at Louis XII, who choked on his laughter and ordered Triboulet be banished from the court. At least he kept his head on his shoulders. And because jesters and fools were valued for their ability to tell the unfiltered truth, they were also tasked with a very dangerous at times job. They were supposed to break really bad news to kings and queens. They had to do it in a very intelligent, very tactful way to avoid retaliation, and most often they resorted to wrapping the bad news in anecdotes or in jokes, making them easier to swallow. One example comes from the court of Louis XIV, King of France. His fool had to deliver the bad news that the French navy was defeated by the English in the Battle of Suez. He found a great solution to this conundrum. He burst into the king's chambers and started berating and whining about the Englishmen. The coward English, the dastard English, the mint-hearted English. The king asked, "Why do you abuse them?" "Because they wouldn't jump out of their ships into the sea as our brave Frenchmen did." This apparently was enough to save him from the king's wrath. And with that, I'm gonna catch my breath for a moment, talk about the miniature, and we'll get ready to start wrapping things up. Now that everything else is done, I'm starting work on the fireballs these devils are holding. Using Daleroni fluorescent orange acrylic ink, I applied layers on the fireballs and on the parts of the devils that are hit by the light, the faces, chests, thighs and arms, giving them dimension and depth. I am going back and forth between all three devils and building up the ink layers, making them brighter and brighter. This will be done selectively, adding more and more layers on smaller and smaller areas, the closer they are to the flame, making them seem even brighter. Welcome back. Because I haven't touched upon jesters, although I mentioned them, I want to clear things up. Starting with the 16th century, fools and buffoons were called jesters. Jester means storyteller. So by talking about licensed and natural fools, I also spoke of jesters. Their role didn't change with the change of their name. Now, let's talk about compensation and what perks and benefits came with this job besides being privy to private conversations, to gossip, to news, being an advisor to people in power. Some jesters, some fools received stipends, sums of money, a salary, but most were simply very well taken care of by their patrons. They received shelter, they received clothing, and they received food. Some jesters were so praised and so valued by their patrons that they arranged to be taken care of after the patron passed. The best example comes from the court of Henry VIII, who hired an individual by the name of William Satan, who was tasked with taking care of the king's fool, Somers, after the king's passing. Fools and jesters were also sometimes gifted titles and lands and sums of money, but not only by their patron. They were also receiving gifts from people around their patrons. Members of the retinue, members of the court, people who wanted to garner some favors. Because who better to bribe than the individuals who were almost constantly at the side of their patrons, advising them or improving their mood. A good example of a fool receiving a very grand gift comes from the court of Henry II, who gifted his jester 30 acres of land upon the jester retiring from the court, with the condition of the said jester returning once per year to the court to leap, whistle and fart for the amusement of the king and his court. Owning land in medieval times was a huge thing. One could easily live off of having land for the rest of their lives, either by selling it or, better yet, by exploiting it, by renting parts of it out to serfs, to commoners, and simply reaping the benefits. Another good example is that of Tom the Fool, who received 50 shillings, the equivalent of 1 year's wages for a commoner, for a good performance during a princess's wedding. If you're wondering, female jesters were very common, and they had the same perks, the same benefits, and the same responsibilities as their male counterparts. Actually, being a fool or a jester was one of the few career paths that was completely open to women and gave the same benefits and had the same responsibilities. A fine example of a female fool is Jane the Fool, who served in the retinue of Princess Mary, daughter of Henry VIII. Another very good example is that of Mathurin the Fool, who served under Henry III, Henry IV, and Louis XIII, and she is known for dressing up as an Amazonian warrior with armor, with a shield and spear. She is said to have been a very intelligent woman with a very sharp tongue, and remained in history for single-handedly apprehending the assassin that tried to take out Henry IV. An assassin managed to circumvent the palace's guards and managed to strike at the king while he was in his chambers. Upon striking with his dagger, the king cried out, Devil, take that fool and her tricks. This drew Mathurin's attention, who immediately barred the door and prevented the assassin from escaping. Now, I don't really know why the king called out that devil, take that fool, because she wasn't the one who struck, but perhaps he thought she was playing a prank. But nonetheless, it is another fine example of how close the fool was to his king. She was the first to hear him shout. She was the first to intervene because she was the closest. She was in the next room. Oh, and I almost forgot. Because every profession requires a uniform, there is a uniform for fools, buffoons, and jesters. That uniform included a cowl, a hood, or a hat that had donkey ears, or was at least reminiscent of donkey ears. They wore sometimes donkey tails, and most of the fools and buffoons wore clothing made out of different patches in different patterns and different colors, mirroring the attire of the most influent people in the court. It was a form of satire, making fun of them, and it was mild enough that people weren't very offended, thus avoiding retaliation again. And with that, let's take one last look at the miniature, I promise, and then we wrap things up. If you've noticed, I applied the correct colors in the wrong order. I applied the reddish tint to the base of the flame and yellow on the top, making the fireballs look cooler on the bottom and hotter on the top. Well, mistakes were made, lessons learned. Too bad I didn't notice this while I was painting and subjected all three miniatures to the same treatment. But, on the other hand, I'm really happy with the result. It really seems like light is reflecting off of these devils. Welcome back, let's wrap things up. And let's talk about the downfall of fools, buffoons and jesters. With the spread of theatre in the 17th and 18th century, the elites started steering away from having fools, buffoons and jesters in their retinue and started attending and enjoying the new form of entertainment. Seeing this and going with the trend, those who were once fools, buffoons and jesters started also reorientating themselves towards theatre. Nowadays, what was once the common entertainment in noble courts throughout the world, from ancient pharaohs to Chinese emperors and to kings and emperors here in Europe and actually across the world, can now only be seen in circuses, where you have buffoons, fools and mimes. And with that, we've managed to barely scratch the history of bards. As I've said at the start of this video and that of the previous video, the 5th edition D&D Bard class has its roots in real-life bards from the Celtic culture, from real-life Skalds in the Norse culture, with elements of Southern European courts sprinkled there within. Bards, Skalds, troubadours and minstrels are lore keepers. They keep traditions, they keep stories and they keep legends alive. And they were the ones to speak the truth when nobody else had the courage to do so. This is what bards were. And if you take, when making a bard character, the recommended background, that of entertainer, you will most definitely see how minstrels and troubadours and, as I called it, Latin blood infiltrated, took over and transformed the original bard class. If you look at the possible backgrounds, you will have actors, dancers, fire eaters, jesters, jugglers, instrumentalists, poets, singers, storytellers and tumblers. All of these are in essence the fools. If you want to keep that lore keeper vibe alive, just go with the Bard class and the Sage background, because as I've mentioned, as I've shown in these two videos, Bards were lore keepers. And if you want to go with the gritty warrior poet Skald vibe, just take the soldier background. But nonetheless, whatever you choose, don't forget to revel in the chaos that the Bard brings to the table. Oh, before we finish, I forgot to mention a very, very famous Bard that I'm sure you've heard of, Scheherazade, from the 1001 Nights. She is the perfect example of a storyteller and mythographer with an extraordinary imagination, creativity, and intelligence. Don't forget, next time you see street performers, depending on the songs and dances they perform, they can be either lore keepers, thespians, minstrels, bards, troubadours, griots, or fools. And with that, thank you so much for the privilege of your time. I truly hope you found inspiration and learned something new today. And I cannot wait to see you all here next week on Funky Monkey A.M.P., the place where you get your weekly dose of miniature painting, history, and world building. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers.